Okay, so in part one, we also, so we know he's compassionate. He is often has a violent temper. He doesn't quite know how he feels about enlisting in the army. So he has mixed feelings about being a soldier, but he believes in protecting those who are innocent and being a guardian. In regards to his sort of gender, his representation of masculinity, we can see that Robert Ross is not your sort of average or typical young man. He is unconventional and often sort of defies or doesn't really understand some of the gender expectations that are placed on him. He's very shy and reserved and a quiet person, and he doesn't understand his role. So some of the sort of gender roles that are present at the time, he doesn't quite understand them or want to take part in them. And this is evident in his relationship with Heather Lawson. So on page 10, it's introduced that Robert is sort of dating this girl named Heather Lawson, but it says Robert was supposed to be interested in Heather Lawson, but the fact was it was she who was interested in him. Not that Robert didn't like her, only that he wasn't interested. Interested led to marriage, and this is what Heather Lawson wanted. So Robert is not sort of playing the role or the gender script that is part of his courtship or whatever with Heather Lawson. She seems to be the one who is more interested in him, and she gets angry when Robert doesn't sort of reciprocate her feelings. And then on page 14, Heather Lawson wants Robert to sort of defend himself when she says that another young man likes her. And she says, well, Robert, you should fight him. And then Robert has no idea why he should fight him. He doesn't understand or sort of take part in these kind of gender roles or gender games that are being sort of thrust on him, and he doesn't really sort of fit the mold of the typical young man at this time. So to him, it just doesn't make sense, and she sort of seems to be playing out some idea that she has that she's read about in a book. So at the bottom of page 14, in short, she made a scene of the sort then popular in books of Booth Tarkington. So at the time, there would be like whatever was popular, like the media at the time, so books. There was sort of discussion of these men's annual or boys' annual books that would depict sort of masculine depictions, and obviously this young woman is reading these kind of soap opera-y books. So she sort of wants to play out gender roles in a specific way that's popular at the time, and then Robert is just a shy, sort of sensitive young man who doesn't quite buy into some of these gender roles that are popular. And he doesn't quite fit in with the other men. There's this description on this page where he's waiting for the train, and then all of the other men are described as kind of bullying each other a little bit, joshing and pushing each other. So this is near the top of the page. So most of them had swaggered up and down the car like braggarts, smoking cigarettes and drinking out of silver flasks. Robert avoided them all through the journey, wanting to protect the last of his privacy. Now they were drifting away in groups of 3 and 4, joshing and pushing one another, calling out names and throwing snowballs, singing songs. So all these young men are waiting again for the train that will take them to sort of the military base. And Robert just does not fit in the same way that the other sort of men are interacting with one another. So he is depicted as a kind of unconventional type of young man, and doesn't quite fit in that narrow box of masculinity that would have been sort of dominant or hegemonic at this time. So before Robert leaves his family, he has a discussion with his mother And this connection between he and his mother sort of develops over the course of the novel, where they separate, and he goes off to war, and she becomes more and more sort of insular and retreats into her own sort of shell of a self. And we learn she's kind of characterized as almost a parallel to Robert, in that she becomes almost as traumatized by the experience of him going away as he does. And, as a mother, she would want to protect her son, but she has this. There's this scene, this interaction between them when he's taking the bath and she's smoking cigarettes, and she's sort of at this point, she's more experienced, more mature, and has had experienced death in her life. Her brother had been hit by a car, so she knows what can happen to her son. Uh, he can easily die at any moment, and she's very much aware of the fragility of life, that it can be taken away from you in an instant. And then she gives this, or she's talking about this anecdote from Robert's childhood where he bruised so easily, and he was such a serious child. He did everything with such great concentration, and but he persevered, and so she's sort of giving him this speech, and she was the one also who sort of told him that he had to kill Rowena's rabbits. So I don't know how you guys interpret that, the fact that his mother made him do that, but she sort of wants him to grow up and gain some closure, I think, in some sense with Rowena, and also uh, sort of maybe blames him as well, or feels like he needs to do this in order to move on. I'm not sure exactly. You can interpret that in your own way. But his mother is an interesting character in the story, and their relationship, he doesn't really see her again after this moment, but they are sort of almost spiritually connected um, throughout the story, where she will also mourn, and she's touched by death throughout her life, so she seems to have more insight into what Robert is facing overseas than any other character, really. So at this point, Robert was admitted into the army. So 1915 is when he begins his training, and we know he's made this decision following Rowena's death. So it was a traumatic circumstance that brought him to the point where he wanted to enlist. So it's kind of like a break. There's been a sort of death of Rowena, but also a kind of death of his childhood innocence, right? So it's kind of a symbolic decision that he makes to enlist in the army. And so at this point, we know he is not your typical kind of masculine figure. He's an unconventional man, but he's doing a very conventional thing by enlisting in the army. So this was what young men were supposed to be doing at the time. It was an expected thing, and Robert was sort of, he has an ideal of what he can be as a soldier, right? He believes a soldier can be a guardian, somebody who protects others, and he's somewhat naive still in his understanding of his role as a soldier. It's a very idealized view that he has. So once Robert enters the army, he almost immediately is looking for somebody, an authority figure that he can sort of emulate and who can teach him how to kill. And he finds this in his sort of role model of Eugene Taffler. So on page 24, Robert articulates what he's looking for a sort of mentor figure. And he says what he wanted was a model, someone who could teach him by example how to kill. Robert had never aimed a gun at anything. It was a foreign state of mind. So what he wanted was someone else who had acquired that state of mind, who killed as an exercise of the will. So Robert is looking for somebody to really teach him to be this violent type of masculinity, or to be a soldier, essentially. And he's looking for somebody who can kill. So that's what he needs to be able to be prepared to do as a soldier. And this is his sort of role model that he finds in Eugene Taffler. So Robert first meets Eugene Taffler when he's sort of uh, they were on horses, or they were looking for horses, Robert and his friend Clifford Purchase, who is another sort of schoolmate who also enlisted. And Clifford and Robert are sort of looking for some wild horses that were to be broken. So they were going to train these horses, and they had to sort of break them first. And Clifford and Robert are out sort of going to collect them. And then they see this figure in the distance, and it's Eugene Taffler. And Taffler already has kind of a reputation amongst the soldiers. And the first instance that they meet Taffler, he is throwing stones at a row of bottles lined up on the board, and he's sort of hitting these bottles and breaking them just by throwing these rocks. And then we learn about Eugene Taffler. This is on page 29. Taffler was a hero. He'd already been to France, wounded, and returned to Canada. Now he was fully recovered and sent west to look over the horse flesh prior to being reposted overseas. He had also been a varsity all-round athlete, and he was a captain as well. So he's a senior officer to Robert and Clifford. So automatically, Robert is kind of interested in Taffler because he is a hero. He's a war hero at this point. He already has a reputation. He's seen overseas. He's been overseas. He's done his service, and now he's just recovering to be sent over again. He also is a varsity athlete, so he has this background as being sort of athletic and accomplished. And in this scene, he's shown throwing stones and breaking bottles, and then at the bottom there on page 29, killing bottles. That's what I'm doing. So almost immediately we have a connection between sort of Robert's desire for somebody to sort of mentor him in the art of killing, of being a soldier, and then him looking up to Eugene Taffler as this kind of model of masculinity that he can emulate and sort of learn from. And yet we have, Taffler is not just this kind of characteristic or a sort of stereotypical soldier. He has more complexity, and we learn this as we go along. And we get a hint of, or sort of foreshadowing of what Robert will learn about Eugene Taffler. But Taffler sort of suggests that this breaking of bottles is a sort of symbolic act, and he's killing bottles, right? But for him, it's just like throwing stones. And the stone itself is kind of a symbolic element in the story. Any sort of mention of nature could be a sort of symbolic moment in the story. But I do see stone as being a kind of representation of Taffler and of masculinity in general, where it's kind of used, it's cold, unemotional, hard, kind of stoic, and used as a weapon. So that's what these soldiers had to become, stone-like. And really, as a soldier, you are supposed to be used to killing, right? So that is what Taffler is sort of representing. And then Taffler says of his experience of the war, it's not what you think it is, and he kind of has a viewpoint that's different than Clifford and Robert. And he says, the distance, he said, between our lines and theirs is often no more than 100 yards. And then he gestured, all you get in this war, he said, is one little David against another. Then he threw and broke the tall, thin neck clean off like that, just a bunch of stone throwers. So he's making an allusion to the myth of David and Goliath. Goliath was a giant, David was just a young man, yet he defeated this giant. So he did something phenomenal, but Taffler's just saying it's just one